Tuesday afternoon at Memorial Trauma, just 5 miles from the Marine Corps Air Station. The ER is a pressure cooker. A multi-car pileup has just sent a wave of critical patients through the doors. Staff are shouting, monitors are screaming. In the corner, Nurse Elena Ward moves with a slight, noticeable limp. A senior surgeon glances at her and snaps, "Ward, stay back. We need full mobility for this wave. Go handle the paperwork." She nods, silent, and retreats. Suddenly, the ground begins to shake. Not one, but 4 heavy-duty Marine Ospreys scream overhead. An officer bursts in, shouting, "Where is Angel 6?" The room freezes. Truth arrives. The hierarchy of a major civilian hospital is often dictated by what the eye can see. And for the busy staff at Memorial Trauma, all they saw when they looked at Elena Ward was a liability. Elena was 30 years old, a recent transfer to the high-stakes emergency department. Her personnel file was professional but intentionally quiet, stripped of the heavy weight it truly carried. Registered nurse, Bachelor of Science, prior military service. In the frantic, ego-driven world of the ER, prior military was a common tag, usually dismissed as a few years spent in a quiet base clinic or a low-level support role. The limp, a rhythmic hitch in her step, was a permanent reminder of a history she never discussed in the break room. To her colleagues, it was a practical hindrance. They saw a woman who couldn't sprint to a crashing patient, someone who was better suited for the triage desk, the supply room, or the mountain of insurance paperwork that everyone else hated. They confused her lack of speed with a lack of capability. They didn't see the calluses on her hands that didn't come from gardening, or the way her pulse stayed at a resting rate even when the trauma sirens began their mournful wail. "She's reliable, sure," the head nurse, Margaret, had remarked to Dr. Sterling during a morning shift review. Margaret was a woman who valued hustle and high-decibel communication above all else. But in a level 1 trauma event, we need people who can move like lightning. Elena is hindered. I've been keeping her on the low-priority bays or the digital charting. It's safer for the patients, and frankly, it's safer for her. We don't need a nurse tripping over a power cord during a code. She just doesn't have the ER edge. Dr. Sterling, a brilliant but notoriously arrogant trauma surgeon who wore his confidence like a bespoke suit, hadn't disagreed. He valued clinical efficiency and visual dominance. He saw Elena's silence and her deliberate, careful gait as signs of someone who had reached their personal limit. He didn't see the way her eyes scanned the room with the cold precision of a tactical drone, mapping the location of every airway kit and chest tube tray before the doors even open. He didn't realize that her limp was actually a calculated rhythm, a way of moving forged in the uneven, blood-slicked terrain of the Hindu Kush, a gait designed to save energy and maintain a perfect center of gravity even when the ground was literally shaking from mortar fire. That Tuesday afternoon, the ER was pushed to its absolute breaking point. A massive pileup on the interstate had flooded the department with broken bodies and screaming relatives. The air smelled of burnt rubber, stale coffee, and the metallic tang of fresh blood. The sirens from the approaching ambulances were constant, a discordant symphony of emergencies that rattled the nerves of even the veterans. Sterling was in the center of the storm, directing residents and nurses with sharp, barked orders that cut through the noise like a blade. When a critically injured patient with a complex multi-system crush injury was wheeled into Bay 3, Elena stepped forward instinctively. She had already prepared a central line kit and a chest tube, anticipating the patient's immediate needs based on the radio report. Sterling barely spared her a glance as he adjusted his surgical loops. "Stay back, Ward. I need people who can pivot on a dime in here. This is going to be a messy stabilization. Go to the nursing station and coordinate the bed assignments for the secondary wave. We need full mobility in this bay, and you're just in the way of the real trauma team." Elena didn't argue. She didn't explain that she could perform a needle decompression or a field bypass with a pocket knife if necessary. She simply nodded, her face a mask of professional neutrality, and retreated into the shadows of the nurses' station. She stood by the monitors, her hands steady, her eyes never leaving the vitals of the patients in the surrounding bays. She was the ghost in the machine, watching the chaos unfold with a detached, analytical focus. She saw the mistakes before they happened. She saw a resident fumbling in intubation because he was looking at the monitor instead of the anatomy. She saw a nurse missing a subtle, lethal drop in mean arterial pressure because she was too busy answering a phone. But in this environment, she was the limping nurse, the one told to stay in the back and handle the digital debris of the dying. To the civilian staff, she was an extra in their daily drama. They didn't realize that Elena was the only one in the room who wasn't riding a wave of panic-induced adrenaline. She was practicing active observation, a habit forged in places where the noise was much louder and the stakes were much higher than a hospital alarm. She was an anchor waiting for the ship to break, intimately prepared for a storm they couldn't even imagine. If you think people are judged too quickly by what they see, comment, "It's unfair." The atmosphere in the ER shifted not by a shout, but by a vibration that started in the soles of everyone's shoes. It began as a low-frequency thrum that made the surgical instruments on the stainless steel trays chatter like teeth. At first, the staff ignored it, assuming it was the hospital's massive backup generators kicking in. But the sound grew into a rhythmic, window-shaking roar that was too heavy for any generator. It was the sound of air being hammered into submission. Outside on the primary helipad, a pad designed for one nimble civilian life flight bird, 4 massive Marine CH-53K King Stallions were descending in a tight, aggressive, tactical formation. The sheer downdraft from the heavy rotors was a physical force, sending debris, traffic cones, and unsecured trash cans flying across the parking lot like projectiles. The hospital's security team scrambled for cover as the gray giants settled onto the concrete, their rotors creating a brownout effect of dust and grit. This wasn't a standard medical transport. This was a combat extraction diverted into a civilian grid by sheer necessity. "What the hell is going on?" Dr. Sterling shouted, looking up from a hemorrhaging patient as the overhead lights flickered and the floorboards groaned under the weight. "We only have one pad. They're going to block the incoming ambulances. Someone get on the radio and tell them to divert to the Naval Hospital. This is a civilian facility." The ER doors didn't just open, they were effectively breached. A Marine colonel, his flight suit still smelling of JP-8 jet fuel and the copper scent of fresh trauma, burst through the entrance. He was flanked by 2 specialized medical technicians carrying a high-tech transport litter that looked more like a portable operating room than a stretcher. They were covered in the fine gray dust of a training exercise gone horribly wrong. A structural collapse during a high-stakes urban simulation at the base. The colonel didn't look for a hospital administrator, a lead surgeon, or even a triage nurse. He scanned the room with a predatory focus, looking for a specific set of eyes he hadn't seen in 2 years but would never forget. "This is an emergency medical divert," the colonel roared, his voice cutting through the clinical hum of the hospital like a thunderclap. "We have multiple Tier 1 casualties with complex blast pattern trauma. We've got an internal hemorrhage on the primary that our field medics can't stabilize. We were told this facility has the anchor on site, the SOMSG specialist." The ER staff stood frozen in a state of collective shock. Sterling stepped forward, trying to regain his authority over his floor, though his voice lacked its usual bite. "I'm the lead trauma surgeon. We weren't notified of a mass casualty military intake. We are currently at capacity from a multi-car pileup. You need to redirect to the Naval Hospital 10 miles north." "The Naval Hospital is fogged in at the ridge. Their surgical suite is down," the colonel snapped, stepping into Sterling's personal space with a menacing intensity. "We don't have 10 minutes, let alone 10 miles. My man is bleeding out into his own retroperitoneal space. I need the specialist. Now. Where is Angel 6? The name hung in the air, foreign and strange to the civilian staff. They looked at each other, confused, some even chuckling nervously at the call sign. "Angel 6? Sir, there's no doctor here by that name. We have Dr. Sterling, Dr. Miller, Dr. Chen. I didn't ask for a doctor who spends his life in a sterilized theater," the colonel yelled, his desperation finally breaking through his command presence. "I asked for the coordinator who managed the mass evacuation in the Kandahar Valley in 2021. The Pentagon's tracking system said she was transferred to this facility's grid. She's the only one who knows the Sentry bypass. If Angel 6 isn't in this room right now, my men are dead before the rotor stops spinning. In the back of the room, near the computer monitors she had been told to manage, Elena Ward stood perfectly still. The limp was forgotten as her muscles tightened into a familiar posture of readiness. She didn't look at the colonel. She was looking at the litter, calculating the angle of the patient's pelvis and the color of the blood on his fatigues. Her spine straightened, her shoulders squared, and her expression shifted from that of a sideline nurse to that of a commander in a different kind of war. She recognized the frequency. She recognized the call sign. The staff watched in a stunned, heavy silence as the quiet, hindered nurse they had dismissed only minutes ago began to move toward the center of the room. She didn't run, but every step she took had a terrifying, focused purpose that seemed to command the very air around her. She wasn't just a nurse anymore. She was a ghost returning to the living. If you realize sometimes the most important person isn't the most visible one, comment, "I was wrong." The colonel's eyes scanned the room with a predatory focus, finally locking onto the woman in blue scrubs approaching from the shadows. He didn't look at her face first. He looked at her wrist, where a small black tactical watch was strapped. Not a civilian model, but a specialized digital unit used by combat evacuation controllers. He saw the way she carried herself, the way her eyes weren't looking at him, but were already analyzing the medical litter being carried in behind him. He saw the faded unit patch tattoo on her left forearm, partially hidden by her sleeve, a stylized wing with a number 6 inside a circle of thorns. It was the mark of the Special Operations Medical Support Group, the SOMSG, the ghosts who jumped in when the medics were already dead. "You're Angel 6?" the colonel asked, his voice dropping from a roar to a tone of profound, desperate respect. It was the tone of a man who had finally found the only person in the world who could stop the clock. Elena gave a single professional nod. "I am, Colonel. What's the count on the other 3 birds?" The limping nurse was gone. In her place was a Tier 1 combat evacuation coordinator and a master of battlefield trauma. Angel 6 wasn't just a nickname. It was a legend in the special operations community. She was the person who could look at 100 dying men in the middle of a sandstorm and determine the exact sequence of movement that would save 99 of them. She was known as the traffic controller of the dying. The ER staff watched in utter, mouth-breathing shock. Margaret dropped her clipboard, the plastic clattering loudly on the tile. Dr. Sterling stood paralyzed as the colonel stepped aside, allowing Elena to take the lead of his trauma bay. The power dynamic of the room shifted so violently it was almost palpable. "Count is 12 red tags, 8 yellows," the colonel briefed, instinctively snapping into a subordinate role. "The primary is the master sergeant on litter 1. Shrapnel migration in the abdominal cavity. He's losing mean arterial pressure fast. We couldn't get a stable line in because of the extreme vibration on the flight through the canyon. He's crashing, Angel." Elena didn't ask Dr. Sterling for permission. She didn't look for a signature or a bureaucratic approval. She walked straight to the first litter, her limp now a rhythmic grounding beat rather than a weakness. It was the walk of someone who had carried 70 pounds of gear through mountains. "Sterling, I need the high-frequency ultrasound and a 14-gauge needle." "Now," Elena commanded. Her voice wasn't loud, but it had a resonant, metallic frequency that demanded immediate compliance. It was the command presence of a quiet professional. Sterling hesitated, his ego struggling to catch up with the reality. "Now wait a minute, Ward. This is my department. You can't just perform invasive procedures without—" "Doctor," the colonel growled, stepping between Sterling and Elena like a wall of granite. "If she tells you to move, you move. If she tells you to hold a vein, you hold it. She has more experience with blast pattern trauma than this entire building combined. She has performed surgeries in the back of a moving Humvee that would make your hands shake. Let her work or get out of the way." Elena was already reading the patient's body with her fingertips, ignoring the politics. She noticed the subtle, telltale distension of the jugular vein, a sign of a tensioned pneumothorax that the panicked field medics had missed in the chaos of the crash. He's not just bleeding out, Elena said, her voice a calm anchor in the storm of shouting and rotors. His heart is being physically squeezed by trapped air in the pleural space. The shrapnel didn't kill him, but your transport almost did. Sterling, I'm not asking again. Ultrasound, now. Kanchon. For the next hour, the ER witnessed a transformation of the entire hospital's DNA. Elena didn't take over the hospital. She synchronized it. She directed the civilian nurses to set up a secondary triage in the lobby for the yellow tags, using techniques that maximize space and speed. She assigned residents to specific litters with instructions that were so technically precise, they left no room for error. She was conducting a masterpiece of survival. She worked with a mechanical, brutal efficiency. When the master sergeant's heart stopped, she didn't scream for a crash cart or a defibrillator. She knew the heart wasn't failing, it was empty. She performed a manual cardiac massage through a localized incision she made herself, her hands moving with a sensitivity that looked like magic to the watching residents. Everyone, focus on the rhythm, Elena said, her voice steady as she held the man's life in her bare hands. Don't look at the helicopters. Don't look at the colonel. Look at the patient's pupils. We are the line between him and the dark. We do not break. She directed the Sentry bypass, a specialized vascular shunt she had invented herself, to bridge a shredded femoral artery. It was a procedure that wasn't in any civilian textbook, yet it worked with a logic that was undeniable. The civilian staff found themselves following her without a single word of question. The arrogance of the doctors had evaporated, replaced by a reverent, heavy awe. They realized that the limp wasn't a sign of weakness. It was a scar of the very missions she was now managing. She had earned that limp by carrying a wounded brother through a live fire zone in a valley no one had ever heard of. She had stayed behind so others could fly out, and she had been doing it in silence for 3 days in their hospital. By the time the last red tag was moved to a stabilized bed in the ECU, the ER was a different place. The noise had settled into a disciplined, professional hum. The angel had done her work. She hadn't done it with force. She had done it with the quiet authority of someone who had seen the bottom of the world and refused to blink. She had turned a civilian ER into a Tier 1 trauma unit in under 60 minutes. If you believe real expertise shows in how someone works, not how they speak, comment, I owe you. 2 hours later, the ER had returned to its usual rhythmic hum, but the atmosphere was permanently altered. The Marine helicopters had spooled up their rotors and departed into the twilight, leaving the tarmac empty and silent, the air still smelling faintly of jet fuel. The casualties were all in recovery or surgery, every single one of them still breathing, because of the intervention of the woman they had called too slow. Dr. Sterling stood at the nurse's station, staring at a blank patient chart. He looked exhausted, his scrub top stained with the dust of the base and the blood of men he barely understood. He looked up as Elena walked by, her gait still slow, her limp still there, echoing softly against the sterile tiles. Elena, Sterling said, his voice quiet and devoid of its usual sharp, condescending edge. She stopped and looked at him, her eyes neutral and clear. Yes, doctor? We told you to stay back, he said, the realization of his own arrogance hitting him with the weight of a physical blow. I thought you were a liability because of your leg. I thought you couldn't handle the pressure of a civilian ER. I didn't even know who you were. I didn't even ask why you were here. Elena adjusted the tactical watch on her wrist. You didn't need to know who I was, doctor. You just needed to see the work. In my world, a title is just something they put on a headstone to make the family feel better. The only thing that matters is the result, and the man on the bed. My limp didn't stop me from saving that sergeant, just like your title didn't help you save him. Margaret, the head nurse, approached them from the supply room. Her eyes were red from the stress of the day. She didn't say a word. She simply handed Elena a fresh cup of coffee and offered a small, trembling nod of respect. It was an apology that didn't need words, a recognition of the quiet professional she had tried to sideline. A young Marine corporal, who had stayed behind to guard the remaining gear and coordinate with the hospital, walked up to the station. He wasn't there for a medical checkup or a signature. He stood at attention, his back straight as a spear, his uniform torn but his spirit intact. He snapped his heels together with a sharp clack that echoed through the entire floor and offered Elena a slow, deliberate, and perfectly executed salute. "Thank you, Angel 6, the Marine whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "The boys and the birds, they knew you were here. That's why they held on. They heard you were the anchor on this grid. We owe you a debt that can't be paid in a hospital." Elena didn't return the salute. She was a civilian now, and she respected the protocols, but she offered a crisp, professional nod and a look that said everything that needed to be said. "Tell the squad to stay hydrated, Corporal, and watch the pressure on the sergeant's left side when he wakes up. He's a fighter, but he's human. And tell the colonel, the bridge held." The hospital staff watched the interaction in a hushed, reverent silence. They realized that the woman they had treated like a basic assistant was actually a pillar of their entire community. They realized that the most dangerous, most capable person in the room was the one who didn't feel the need to prove it until the world was falling apart. Elena went back to her station. She picked up the stack of insurance paperwork she had been assigned earlier that morning. She didn't ask for a promotion. She didn't demand a public apology from the hospital board. She didn't even mention the fact that she had just performed 3 specialized surgical procedures that weren't in her job description. She just went back to work, because the quiet professional doesn't need an audience to do the right thing. As she walked down the hallway at the end of her shift, her limp echoing softly against the sterile tiles, the other nurses and doctors stepped aside to let her pass. They didn't look at her with pity or condescension anymore. They looked at her with a quiet, reverent awe. The angel was back in the shadows, but they all knew she was watching, and they all felt a lot safer knowing she was the anchor holding their world together. If you believe humility is the mark of true strength, comment, "I will live honorably." In our modern high-speed world, we are conditioned to value the loud. We are taught that the person with the most followers, the most visibility, the most impressive title on a business card is the one who deserves the most respect. We judge books by their covers every single day of our lives, dismissing those who don't fit our visual narrative of success. We see a quiet person in a corner, and we assume they are insignificant. We see a physical limitation, like a limb, and we assume a lack of inner capability. But the story of Elena Ward, the Angel 6, is a powerful, enduring reminder of a deeper, more profound truth that our society often forgets. True competence is often quiet. It doesn't need to bark to be heard. It doesn't need to prove itself to a room full of strangers with inflated egos. Real skill is found in the steady hands and the focused gaze of someone who has stared into the absolute chaos of existence and refused to blink. It is the result of thousands of hours of unseen study, years of relentless, agonizing practice, and a commitment to a code of ethics that exists far above the ego. Elena didn't step into that trauma bay because she wanted to be a hero or receive a medal. She stepped in because she was the person who was ready. She understood that in a crisis, the most dangerous thing isn't the injury itself. It's the noise of the panic and the weight of the ego. She chose to be the anchor that held the ship steady while the storm raged. When you look at the people around you, your colleagues, your neighbors, the strangers you pass on the street, remember Elena. Remember that the person you might be dismissing as just a bystander, just a nurse, or just someone who is slow might be the same person who would stand between you and the fire without ever asking for a thank you or a headline. The world is full of quiet professionals who do the work that no one sees so that we can live the lives that everyone wants. Respect isn't something you give to a title or the volume of a person's voice. It's a recognition of the character they show when no one is watching and there is no reward other than the safety of others. It is the highest form of service, to protect without ego, to lead without a title, and to leave without a trace. It is the legacy of the hidden anchor. Always look deeper. Always value the quiet professional. Because one day the sky will turn dark, the ground will shake, and you'll find yourself praying for someone like Angel 6 to stand up and hold your world together. You'll realize then that the person you ignored was the most important person in the room. Be that person. Be the calm in the storm. Be the anchor for those who are drifting, because in the end, It is the silence of the expert that makes the loudest difference. If you believe the people who are quietly prepared are the ones who step up when it matters most, leave a comment below. And if this story reminds you that true strength is often hidden behind what others underestimate, don't forget to subscribe for more.